Good evening, friends. Welcome to Empty Cloud Monastery. Maya Soma, and I'm here with Bhante Sutaso. And we also have another venerable, who hopefully will join us next week because she's currently jet lagged. So we won't reveal who she is. You'll have to tune in next week in order to find out who is currently residing at Empty Cloud Monastery. Anyway, welcome to Kumo, Mary, and Charles Lee, who are checking in and saying hello. Good to see you, friends, and welcome to everyone else that I only see as a little number. Oh, hello, Kevin. Good to see you. And Sud, Jayanta, welcome to all of our friends. And whenever you're ready, you're welcome to type in any questions you might have, and we'll try our best to answer them. Hello to Patricia, good to see you. All right, so Charles Lee asks, I listened to Bhante Sudaso's teaching of the Ogatarana Sutta earlier. I heard alternate translation of the teacher's response to the Devata. By not hurrying and by not tarrying, I crossed the flood. For me, it's important.
It imparts,
a different understanding, meaning than by not halting and by not straining, I cross the flood. Is this alternate translation useful?
It's useful. It's just not correct. So that's also an aspect of our practice, is that we're not hurrying, but we're also not wasting time. But that's not what the Buddha says in that sutta. And the word that's used is, actually uses two words. So patittati, which means to stand firm, and santittati, which means to stand, like, completely stay still. So translating that as not hurrying is just not correct. It's just not a correct translation. It quite literally means standing still. So translating it as anything else is just not correct. But as a way of explaining the basic purpose of the Buddha's statement, then that's okay. So there's a difference between a translation and an explanation. So a translation should be accurate and precise, whereas an explanation can be more fuzzy because it's trying to communicate the feeling of what the Buddha is saying. And therefore it doesn't necessarily need to be precise.
Okay, well, Thank you, Venerable. And hello to Jenny and Angela and Shadow of Label, who says, don't forget to say hi to me.
Hello, Shadow of Label.
And hello to Will as well. And Sud asks, how far can one realistically get from the practice of the Dhamma in this day and age as a lay person with all these distractions and lack of time for dedicated meditation practice? As far as you put effort in, essentially. So actually, I really appreciated when Ajahn Pasano a few months ago gave a talk for us monastics, actually, but it's shared on our channel. And one of the reflections that actually he invited to remember was that at the time of the Buddha, the majority of stream enterers were lay people, not monastics, because there are more lay people in this world. Not everybody becomes a monastic. So literally, I mean, this path is complete because it gives the ability for anyone who really is committed to the practice of liberation to cultivate all aspects of the Noble Eightfold Path in whatever circumstance they are, whether they are lay people or whether they are monastics. So it's not that by just wrapping up, ourselves with robes and going to a monastery, we automatically attain awakening. I mean, I wish that was the case. That would be like really great. I mean, I thought so actually. When I first ordained, I was so happy that for a week there was hardly any greed, hatred, and delusion in my mind. So I thought, oh, wow, the only thing I needed to do was ordination. Wow, it's incredible. All the things that used to irritate me, like, have stopped irritating me. I love everyone. This is incredible. I'm so close to awakening. And then after a week, all my defilements decided to ordain with me. And they came back to keep me company. So essentially, I hadn't uprooted them, right? They were only kind of appeased for the time being. So right now, in my current circumstances, it's very useful and beneficial to have this form. And I see that I'm capable of moving forward in the path, and my defilements are decreasing and my wholesome states are increasing. But there was a time when actually I was doing the same thing in a lay form practice. And so you mentioned in your question meditation, but meditation is one or two at best aspects of the Noble Eightfold Path. So there's everything else that one can cultivate as a lay person, and also as a monastic, of course. And in our practice, we need to aim at stream entry, not at nibbana immediately, because we have to, in order to get to nibbana, we need to get through it by stream entry. So it's completely accessible. Actually, Ajahn Paisano was inviting us also to reflect that the level of samadhi needed for stream entry is actually quite minor and quite, not necessarily essential. So there are all the other aspects that we see, in fact, in traditional Asian Buddhism. There is the majority of Buddhists in the world. They don't really spend so many times in silent meditation retreats, but actually, what do they spend the most time in? Giving, right? And in the practice of sila, in the practice of dana. And so by practicing relinquishment, for example, since one is a little baby, people will come to the temple and learn and, how to make anjali. So respecting both the Sangha and the Buddha and the Dhamma, and giving, letting go. So it's a very simple way of actually practicing relinquishment, letting go, which then creates incredible fertile conditions to then practice samadhi during retreats, as we see whenever our friends, our Thai friends or Sri Lankan friends, or people from Buddhist countries come here and practice. They have much easier time. So focus at where you're at right now. What can you do, and put effort into cultivating all these wholesome mind states, and not being too result driven, but actually focusing more on the practice, and then the results come inevitably because we're practicing the teachings of the Buddha. And it's kind of like 1 + 1 = 2. So if we focus on putting the one plus the other one, and then automatically, inevitably, we'll get the result. So that was a long story, very long. And in the meanwhile, we've had a few messages pop up. Hello to Victor, Spike Girls, very cute name, and Putrika, Gita, hello. So Will says, is it unskillful to cling to the Dhamma until one gains awakening?
No, in fact, that's exactly what you should be doing. You should cling to the Dhamma right up until you attain full awakening. That's the one thing that you should not let go of until the last moment.
Yeah, actually, in the Therigatha that I translated last year, in the verses of the Bhikkhunis, they're both instructions actually clearly by the Buddha to the Bhikkhunis. And the Buddha says, let go of all bounds, but bound to the Dhamma. Chain yourself up to the Dhamma, essentially. Attached to the Dhamma, not to the Adhamma. Attached to it. And then you'll relinquish all attachments. So, and also the Bhikkhunis, actually, when they talk about themselves, also talk about it in that way of how they're practicing attached, holding very tightly to the Dhamma. Not unskillful to cling to it, actually quite the opposite. And Kevin says, did the Buddha ever address how to talk to young children about the practice and the precepts? My eldest is at the age where he fibs quite a lot, and it worries me. Bad karma. What does fibs mean about that?
It means to tell lies.
Oh, I see.
So the Buddha didn't say much about specifically how to talk to children, but definitely it is your responsibility as a parent to teach your children, especially sila, when they're young. Usually when children are young, you focus on teaching them dana and sila. It's not much use trying to teach samadhi to a 2-year-old. You can try if you like, but focus on dana and sila, and samadhi maybe can wait till they're a bit older.
Great, thank you, Bhante. And Kuhn says, Venables, I read the Kirimananda Suttas this week. Did I understand it correctly that not all illnesses, afflictions are due to one's past karma? For example, change of weather, not taking care of yourself, overexertions. But aren't the last two due to volition and therefore karma? The translation was from Sutta Central and also from Access to Insight.
Yeah, that's correct. The last two are based on volition and therefore are karma. And actually being born in a place with volatile weather that affects your health, that also is the result of karma from past lives. So ultimately, it's still all karma. It's just a matter of whether it's direct or indirect. At least that's my understanding of how the Buddha explains it. Very popular topic. It comes up very often.
Yeah. Also, I mean, there's, I guess, past karma. I mean, the changing of the weather is kind of inevitable. So it's like the consequence of a human rebirth. So I think that's also why the Buddha highlights, understanding like the distinctions. Of course, the human rebirth is the consequence of our past karma. And so it's the vipaka of having a human existence. But at the same time, the human existence comes with living in a world with different weathers, different shifts. There's night and day, and there's a lot of different conventional things. So if we start thinking that everything is the result of past karma, then it removes the sense of agency that we have in our life, which is why it's important to think that, yes, we are experiencing vipaka, the result of past actions, but we're also making new karma in every single moment. And that's what we should be worrying about. Not thinking that, things are, oh, poor me, I live in New Jersey where there is, it's so cold in the winter. Oh, I've done so many bad deeds in the past. No, I just decided to live in New Jersey. If I go to the south of Italy, it's warmer, or if I go to Sri Lanka, it's even warmer. So we have agency in what we are. I mean, I decided to live in New Jersey. So this is obviously the conditions that are here. But we need to be a little bit more proactive in how we go about the world.
Yeah, it's important not to generate a victim mentality of always thinking of yourself as being a victim, but rather to reflect that you always have the ability to make choices, and those choices will shape your future conditions.
And if we don't like something, we make different choices. It's quite great, eh? And Guy says, or Gui maybe, Srinath. I'm not good with French, but Gui says, I'm practicing Nichiren Shu as a layperson. I practice meditation twice a day. Any suggestions on overcoming lust? Shantideva's words on meditative concentration has helped.
Yeah, so the most important thing actually is to pay attention to how you nourish lust throughout the day. So, for example, do you watch shows that have sexually enticing imagery? Do you play games that have sexually enticing imagery? Do you read books that conjure up thoughts of sexuality or romance? Do you engage in conversations that spark those kinds of thoughts? Do you deliberately produce or entertain thoughts of sensuality? And again, especially things related to sexuality or romantic involvements. What do you do when you encounter any kind of sensory experience which reminds you of sexuality? Do you direct your mind towards such things, or do you pull your mind away from such things? So I would actually really encourage you to closely watch. What are you doing throughout the course of your daily life that's nourishing your interest in sexuality? And try to change those habits. Do something else with your mind. So avoid anything, any kind of experience, any kind of sensory experience, or uh, anything in media, or any conversation or anything whatsoever which inflames your lust. Just don't do it. Don't go there. Don't point your mind there. Instead, point your mind in the opposite direction. So sometimes people try to do practices like asubha, contemplating the unattractiveness of the body, to reduce their lust. But then at the same time, they're doing lots of things that increase their lust. So this creates this internal battleground, which is extremely uncomfortable and ultimately unproductive. It doesn't actually lead to anything good. You can practice asubha bhavana for 30 minutes and then practice subha bhavana for 23 and a half hours. And that's really not going to achieve very much now, is it? So you should be actively, start really contemplating. What are you doing that's causing there to be lust in your mind in the first place? And stop doing those things.
Yeah, another thing that I might add is also contemplating in hindsight. So, like, for example, the times in the past when we've been attracted to someone, and then at the very beginning it was great, and then after a while you start noticing bad breath, smelly things. Like, it's not really that great anymore, right? So usually in the past, then we swap, we change, we shift to another object, essentially, of meditation. It's exactly what we do in meditation practice. When we get bored with the breath, then we switch to something else, or we switch to the past, the present, the future, and we're like, oh, maybe I'll switch meditation object, etc. That's exactly what we do in daily life, and so with partners as well. So we're like, oh, okay, actually this person is not that great as I thought it was. I'm sure the other one is going to be great, and then they stink just like the one before, and then so you go like, the third one I'm sure is going to be so great, and then they start stinking too, and it's just constantly stinking, right? So we do both subha and asubhas, but if we contemplate how we've done it in the past, and then we start seeing this passion, disenchantment in the happening in the mind, going, oh, I see you, mind, tricking me. I see you, like, going through the same pattern all over and all over again. And then when the subha starts appearing, you're like, oh yeah, that's so predictable. And now then there is going to be the asubha too afterwards. So you don't get even to the stinking part anymore. You're just like, okay, that's it. Bante is slightly amused.
I am often slightly amused.
And Patricia says, could the Venerables please share some words of meditating while listening to Dhamma talks?
To be honest, that's actually quite challenging. In my opinion, I think it's better to focus on listening to the Dhamma talk rather than trying to meditate. Instead, focus on listening to the words of Dhamma and seeing if there's anything useful there, or anything inspirational, or anything informative. If you want to meditate, then actually it would be mindfulness of mind, watching the mind objects appearing and vanishing. That's the only meditation method I can think of that's really particularly relevant in that case. If you try to do samadhi practice, it's not going to be very effective, because your mind will tend to constantly turn towards the words and ideas. Yeah.
And Charles Lee is mentioning actually how Venerable Thich Nhat Hanh has died today. Unfortunately, big loss, but he's done so many contributions here in the West. And I just wanted to mention, actually, related on to Patricia's question, that one thing actually that Venerable Thich Nhat Hanh taught was deep listening, which is something actually that can be really good to use when listening to Dhamma talks, which is essentially whatever word is being said, you repeat it in your mind, so that you are actually engaged in what is being said, instead of like going like, okay, now I'm bored and like to-do list, or what is for dinner, or blah 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 blah. So these are practices like deep listening that is usually done, actually not necessarily for Dhamma talks, but can be used for Dhamma talks as well. But it's to actually learn how to listen to people, aside from learning how to. We're very good at like talking a lot to people, but a little bit harder to listen sometimes. And so Charles Lee is mentioning about Thich Nhat Hanh. I understand that all individual things pass away. So how would you translate or interpret gate gate paragate parasangate bodhisvaha?
So literally what it's saying is, it's saying gone, gone, gone beyond, completely gone beyond awakening. And the last word, svaha, is kind of like hallelujah. I'm actually just speculating if it might be related to the word sadhu, but I need to look that up, so don't take my word for it just yet. So gone, gone, gone beyond, completely gone beyond. It's talking about going beyond one's defilements. That's basically what it's saying, going beyond defilement and delusion. Going completely beyond defilement and delusion. That's what it's talking about. So again, this is imagery that Buddha uses all throughout the Pali Suttas. The concept of going beyond, going up. Parang means beyond, or to the far shore. So paragate means gone to the far shore, gone beyond all suffering, gone beyond all defilement and delusion. Yep.
And Charles Lee also asked, do you think that Thai was an awakened being? I am not sure, because I have never met him, but he was definitely an incredibly accomplished being. And he has done incredible work to spread the Dhamma, has shared incredible teachings, the teachings of the Buddha. So yeah, impressing sentient being. So if I can attain even just a little bit of what Thich Nhat Hanh has attained in this lifetime, I'm quite happy. Be quite happy about that. And Sud says, can one commit bad karma in one's dreams during sleep? And conversely, can one perform good karma in dreams during sleep?
So any deliberate action performed intentionally produces karma. So that does also include during dreams. So in a dream, for example, if you really genuinely believe that you're holding a knife, and you really genuinely believe that there's a person standing in front of you, and you make the decision, I'm now going to stab the person that's in front of me, then you've just produced an act of mental karma. And that is in fact bad karma. Then you wake up and you're struck with remorse, hopefully. But there's also the recognition, oh, it was just a dream. So you committed an act of mental karma, but not an act of physical karma. So it's much less strong than if you did such a thing in real life. But as I understand the Buddha's teachings, that does still produce some karma. That said, in dream states, the mind is usually quite blurry and confused, which also greatly weakens the strength of the karma. So performing an act with complete clarity and awareness makes the karma much stronger. So if with full clarity and awareness of purpose and intention, you stab another person, that is extremely bad karma. If with a blurry, hazy, confused mind in a dream, you stab a dream person during a dream, That's still producing some bad karma, but it's much, much more mild. And actually, what you'll notice is that as you commit thoroughly to Buddhist practice during waking hours, that will influence your dreams. So that even in dreams, you won't be tempted to do bad things. Your sense of morality will still be with you even when you're dreaming. So you'll avoid bad karma even when you're dreaming.
Shante. And Hasanta asks, Vipassana is trendy these days. But I noticed there is no right Vipassana in the Noble Eightfold Path. But Vipassana and Samadhi seem to go hand in hand in the suttas. Why isn't it part of the Noble Eightfold Path, please? Shante.
It is. It's just not using the specific word Vipassana. So it's under right view. That's the most immediately obvious place to put it, is in right view, Samadhi. Because Vipassana arises from right view, and it also develops right view. So, for example, one has the right view, all things are impermanent. Based upon that right view, one practices the meditation of recognizing impermanence. And based upon that meditation, one comes to a deep experiential understanding that all things are impermanent, which then fuels your right view. So right view is both the precedent for Vipassana practice and also the consequence of Vipassana practice. So that's where I would say it most clearly fits into the Eightfold Path.
And Kumu asks, are the suttas in Sanyutta Nikaya also in Majjhima Nikaya or Digha Nikaya, or do they occur only in Sanyutta Nikaya? So there's always a little bit of overlap between, like my tongue was overlapping, but there's also just suttas that are only in the Sanyutta Nikaya that are not present in Majjhima Nikaya or Digha Nikaya. It's always great to reread them anyway. So yeah, that's all I have to say. And William says, Dear Venerables, first of all, thank you so much for all you do to spread the Dhamma. Very kind. Also like to acknowledge the great Thich Nhat Hanh, sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Yes, his incredible work. My question, I have been reading suttas for many years, but in no particular order. This year, I have resolved to read the entire Sutta Pitaka systematically. Sadhu. In what order would you recommend that I proceed? Thank you once again to all for everything you do, Metta.
Well, I usually recommend that you start with the Majjhima Nikaya, then the Samyutta Nikaya, then the Anguttara Nikaya. Once you've gone through those three, then Digha Nikaya, as well as the four short poetry collections from the Khuddaka Nikaya. So the Dhammapada, Udana, Itibuttaka, and Suttanipata. Once you've gone through all of that, then if you like, you can also read more of the Khuddaka Nikaya, though it's not strictly necessary because the rest of the Khuddaka is technically not words of the Buddha. Though the Theragatha and Therigatha contain many very interesting teachings of the Buddha, so those are worth reading as well. That's my recommended order. So Majjhima, Samyutta, Anguttara, Digha, Khuddaka. That's my recommendation.
Mark says, I have a friend who is interested in non-dual states. Can one experience this in Buddhism, or is this only possible when enlightenment happens?
Well, you can experience it to some degree whenever you practice the perception of emptiness. But full experience of non-duality is only possible with full awakening. Because up until then, there's always a sense of self-identity, which is always creating a sense of separation.
Thank you. And I think these are there twice.
Oh, yeah, I doubled the comments. That's odd.
Oh, and Hasanta as a follow-up, another Bhante told me it just comes automatically when you have strong samadhi.
Not necessarily. So there's a lot of people who practice samadhi, but without right view and without trying to come to a deeper understanding of the Buddha's teachings, without trying to experientially see the Buddha's teachings, then samadhi will only just be samadhi. So samadhi is an important precedent for vipassana practice, but samadhi does not necessarily automatically result in insight. This is made quite clear in countless suttas. You can practice only samadhi, and the result is just that you'll be reborn in the Brahma worlds. You also need to cultivate insight one way or another. It doesn't happen automatically. That said, there are ways of practicing meditation which are conjoined samatha vipassana that will simultaneously develop both samadhi and wisdom. There are some methods like that, though they're quite difficult, but they do exist.
So would you say, Bhante, that that vipassana is the result of right view, sati, and samadhi? Would that be correct?
Yeah. I mean, that's one way of that's one way of talking about it. Yeah.
Ajahn Brahmali translated vipassana as clear seeing in his Satipatthana workshop this year.
Yeah, that's a pretty good translation. Yeah. And that's the last question from online.
So it seems. Yes.
Yeah. Any questions from the residents here? Anagarka Jens, go ahead.
So my question I have is about the idea of, I was a very active mind, and so in terms of investigating Dhamma, what recommendation do you have? Like for myself, sometimes it just turns into papancha, like just overthinking. And any recommendations you have in terms of investigation Dhamma or the Buddhist words in terms of charnel ground contemplations, how to keep that from just, because my mind, when I do those things, my mind sometimes will just kind of spin and becomes papancha, like it just goes.
Well, first off, if you recognize that a certain practice is just producing papancha, then stop doing that. So when something is getting bad results, do something else. Stop whatever you're doing. Investigation of Dhamma, there are several ways of practicing that. One is actually to intellectually contemplate a teaching. But the more subtle way of doing things is to try to directly feel a teaching. So, for example, the Buddha said all things are impermanent. Well, you can sit there and think about what that means intellectually, and that's okay to a point. But my understanding is that Dhammavicaya, so investigation of Dhamma, in this case, it would mean actually directly feeling the impermanence of your experience. So directly, so again, like I can talk about heat and I can write essays about heat, but feeling heat is completely different from writing an essay about heat. So in the same way, you can talk about impermanence and think about impermanence, but until you feel it, you don't really understand it. Other aspects of Dhammavicaya are actually, if you're having problems with a lot of papancha and overactive thinking, well, watch those thinking processes, watch those thoughts, and see how they arise from defilement and delusion, and also how participating in them produces further defilement and delusion. So, like the person's earlier asking about sensuality, well, if you notice a sensual thought arising in the mind, well, you might actually know why it arose. You might see that thought arise, and you're like, oh, it's because I was staring at that one enticing poster when I was in town the other day. And now I imprinted that image in my mind, and now it's appearing again. And then you might notice, and when I fixate on this thought, then the sensual urges get stronger. So even as you're engaging in unwholesome mental activities, you can be examining how there's a causal process going on there, and how one's volitional participation in that causal process is what's causing the defilements to get stronger. So this is one way that you can, even while immersed in defilement and delusion, you can still be cultivating wisdom. Of course, it's better just to not fuel those kinds of thoughts in the first place. But if that's what's currently going on, then you can watch it in this way, and some wisdom will arise.
Almost take like a step back from it and just watch it at the process.
Yeah, take a third-person perspective on your own thoughts and emotions. It's amazing how powerful that practice is. Taking the backward step, as Zen Master Dogen put it. Take the backward step. Okay.
Thank you.
Hello, Kevin. Good to see you. Good friend. And Sud asks, why do defilements come up in the mind even when one resolves to avoid defilements? Even when one knows it's a defilement, why is it so difficult to eliminate it? It's almost like a con. Well, it's because of our tendency of mind to focus on trying to I think there's also a saying in English, right? Don't cry on spilled milk, right?
Don't cry over spilled milk.
Don't cry over spilled milk.
Is that right? Yeah.
I translated it from Italian, but I remembered that it was non piangere su latte versato. Don't
cry
don't
over
cry
spilled
over
milk.
spilled milk. So that's exactly what we do in terms of when we start complaining about the defilements in the mind, is we cry over spilled milk. So we already spilled the milk and we see the defilement arising. So our practice should be to understand that that is vipaka. So that is the result of previous actions. That's the consequences of our actions in the past. And so with Buddhism, we understand, first and foremost, we start identifying and distinguishing causes from effects, and then taking ownership of creating new causes, so that then that will lead to different effects. So the habits of mind are, they are what they are, right? So they are causes, and so they are products of the consequences of past actions. What we can do is, once again, develop a mind of loving kindness, develop a mind of mudita, of rejoicing in others' good fortune, develop a mind of compassion, develop a mind of equanimity. And then we see that we'll have different effects. But yeah, in the process, there will also be a bunch of defilements that will come presumably out of nowhere, because we don't remember all our past lives, right? So it seems like it's out of nowhere, but in reality, it's out of somewhere. It's just that we stop creating the same actions, so we'll have different consequences, and we'll be a much nicer and better place to dwell. It's great. Yeah. That's why it's so fantastic, Buddhist practice. We don't have to wait until full enlightenment. We actually can get some release from suffering right now. And keep releasing suffering until then there's no suffering anymore. And we're fully awakened. And Kumo says, Venerables, what are your thoughts on the present trend of introducing mindfulness, especially in the Western psychology, without emphasizing sila, conduct, as a foundation for mindfulness meditation?
And I think it's mostly okay. It just doesn't have anything to do with Buddhism. We also teach children not to steal. And you might say, oh, well, that comes from Buddhism. Not stealing is one of the 5 precepts, therefore it comes from Buddhism. And it's like, well, that is part of Buddhism. But we teach children not to steal just as an ordinary secular thing in order to promote a harmonious society. So it is part of Buddhist practice, but it's also something which is just done in a secular context for secular reasons. So in the same way, mindfulness is part of Buddhist practice, but there's also people who do secular mindfulness for secular reasons in ways that makes people a little bit happier and a little more socially harmonious. That's fine. It just doesn't have anything to do with Buddhism. So if people want to use mindfulness in psychology in order to be a little bit happier and more socially adjusted, that's fine. Just doesn't have anything to do with Buddhism.
Andrew?
You had mentioned some practices that yoke insight and samadhi together. But you didn't list any. Could you list some?
Well, number one on the list is silent illumination. That's it.
Sorry, can you repeat the question? Because probably people haven't heard.
So a resident, Andrew, is asking for examples of practices that combine samatha and vipassana. And I said the main example is silent illumination. That's the most immediate example. Yep. It's kind of the flagship samatha vipassana method.
And Steve asks, thank you for these awesome teachings. Oh, you're very kind. Been recently hearing water droplets like I'm in a cave when in deep meditation. Any ideas, please?
Yeah, I mean, it just sounds like auditory hallucinations, which are not particularly uncommon in practicing samadhi, but it doesn't really mean anything. The important thing is not to place any importance on it. It's actually quite normal when one gets into deep samadhi. It's quite normal to experience all kinds of strange things. Just don't let it distract you. Stay focused on your meditation. It was actually really cute. There was a Dhamma talk by Chan Master Sheng Yen where he said that when you're deep in meditation, there's two kinds of strange phenomena that can occur. There's ones which are signs of psychic powers developing, and ones which are not signs of psychic powers developing. Either way, pay no attention and keep meditating. I'm paraphrasing here. But that was his basic point. He's like, sometimes these things are meaningful, usually they're not. Either way, don't pay any attention. Just keep doing the meditation. So water droplets, okay, sure. I've had stranger things. Don't worry about it. Just keep doing your meditation.
Thank you, Bhante. And Patricia asks, would Venables consider offering online retreats sometime? We've done it in the past, and actually we'll do it in the future. We're about to go on retreat ourselves. But as soon as we come out, I think that's actually a nice thing to do. Maybe with a small group, signing up in advance. We'll organize it and let you know. But yeah, I have a few ideas floating in the mind. And Janaki says, yes, people will understand more clearly if the word harmonious is used rather than using the words right and wrong, which are quite relative terms. Interesting perspective. And Kevin says, question about the use of medications during the Buddha's time versus now in the context of practicing meditation. How to work with medicines for pain, etc. to function, but not cloud the mind. This is a great question for you, actually, Bhante, as I am not too well versed in medicine.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, it's a question about what brings the most benefit to your practice. So if it's the case of a medicine which doesn't cloud your mind at all, then I would say if it's helpful, then use it. If it's the case of a medicine which does cloud the mind to some extent, then you need to ask yourself whether it's worth the trade-off. So some people have very severe chronic pain, and their samadhi is not strong enough yet in order to sit with that kind of pain. So they use strong prescription medications in order to, prescribed by a doctor. They use strong painkillers in order to bring them into a relatively peaceful mind state where they're not just distracted by the overwhelming pain. And then they can start developing some samadhi. And then maybe at a later time, they can practice samadhi with less of the intoxicating painkiller in their body. But sometimes in the beginning, if you have really strong chronic pain, then you just accept that you need to use strong painkillers, which might have side effects. So of course, it's best not to take any medications that blur the mind or cloud the mind. And medications which don't cloud the mind, I think, are pretty much fine. Just pay attention and make sure there's not any harmful consequences to your practice. Those are my thoughts anyway.
And Hasanta asks, the term in the Noble Eightfold Path is right and not perfect. Is there any significance in this, or is it just semantics? Actually, Bhante, you're the Pali expert, so maybe you can help.
So the Pali word is samma, and the word samma has several different meanings. One is the sense of correct, which is right. Another meaning is complete. Another meaning is harmonious. Another meaning is good, in the sense of morally good. Another meaning is peaceful. So the word samma has a wide range of meanings, which all together point to what the Buddha was trying to say. Those are a few thoughts on that.
Thank you. And Sud asks, it would have been easier to know one's past lives so that one can know where one has left off in practice. Did anyone ask the Buddha why this wasn't so, that we all remember past lives? Well, I would say that here we're getting in the realm of the speculation that the Buddha encourages us not to do. Because that's how actually we create, getting back to your previous question, Sud, about, creating certain causes for certain effects. And these questions are the causes that create the effect of Sakaya Ditti. So of the sense of self, or of reinforcing our identity. So who I was in the past, what did I did in the past, what am I going to do in the future, who will I become in the future, who am I? I have a lot of things to ponder, right? And so instead the Buddha says, which is actually amusing to read that in the Sabbasava Sutta, Majjhima Nikaya 2, is that correct? The Sabbasava Sutta, one of my favorite suttas that made a huge impact in my mind, especially this passage where the Buddha pretty much lays out all our ways of thinking about ourselves and how we reinforce our sense of self. And it's just so human, actually. It's just so beautiful in a way of how this applies to every single sentient being in the world. Today in America, 2,500 years ago, in ancient India, and since beginningless time, right? We all ask ourselves the same questions. And the Buddha says, well, that's a big waste of time in the best case scenario and harmful in the worst case scenario. And all we should do instead is go back to the Four Noble Truths. This is suffering. This is the cause of suffering. There is the end of suffering. And this is the way out of suffering, the Noble Eightfold Path. So what we've done in the past, it doesn't matter. What we have, what is important is right now. Right now we have the teachings of the Buddha. We are capable of understanding the teachings. We are interested in the teachings. It's amazing. You say later on that you found the teachings later on. So have I. I was not born Buddhist, right? So it's actually great when we remember how much more difficult, life was, so many more questions, right? that were random, and so much more suffering and no way out of suffering, right? But now we actually have these teachings and we're curious, we're interested, and we can make progress in the path, and that's all it's important. So we can practice right here, right now, and the consequences will be inevitable in a good way. And how is meat eating permitted by monastics if ethical discipline is such an important factor in the Dharma?
Well, in the suttas, it's stated that the act of eating meat in and of itself is not bad karma. But what can be bad karma is how you acquire that food in the first place. So for a monastic who is given meat, which they have not requested, but it's given to them spontaneously, and the monastic does not have any reason to believe that the animal was killed specifically for them, we're permitted to eat that because we are not karmically responsible for any act of killing. So on the polar opposite is you have somebody who, for example, goes hunting, kills a deer, and eats it. That is clearly unwholesome because they've killed a sentient being. And then in between, you have the whole spectrum of people who buy food from a butcher or buy food in a market and therefore are indirectly contributing to the suffering of sentient beings. So that's milder than killing it yourself, but still producing some amount of bad karma. But the act of eating meat itself is blameless. And if the meat is acquired in a completely blameless way, then no bad karma is created.
Thank you, Bante. No more questions for now. And Sudha, by the way, your questions are not too simple. They're great. So keep them going.
Okay.
Anything else?
Earlier in the week, I had asked about the Brahma Vihars. They're conditioned for us in a person that's enlightened. The question then I did have the question, do they become unconditioned? When I reflected more upon that, I think they become like Kuan Yin, her compassion is unlimited. So then that idea, do the Brahma Viharas become unconditioned as we come within enlightened beings?
I'm not sure what you mean by unconditioned here.
Unlimited.
Unlimited, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Great.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, that was easy.
I thought more.
I like easy questions.
So is it then that wholesome qualities are simply a natural property of the mind and are simply obscured by defilements, like they're intrinsic to?
And fundamentally, nothing is intrinsic to anything. Nothing has any inherent nature of any sort. So sometimes we talk about Buddha nature, but even that needs to be clearly understood as something which itself also is a conditional phenomenon specific to samsara. Ultimately, nothing has any inherent nature whatsoever. The mind is not inherently wholesome or inherently unwholesome. The mind is not inherently anything at all. So, no, I wouldn't say that the mind is inherently wholesome and is obscured by defilements. I think that's getting into actually quite dangerous territory. It's verging on wrong view because it's positing a fundamental ground of being for a mind, and that's getting, again, it's getting dangerously close to attavada. So I would steer away from that.
But there's the Bante, the famous Dhammapada quote, luminous is the mind. So how would you?
That's actually from the Anguttara Nikaya.
Oh.
So
Oopsie.
luminous is the mind, but it is darkened by visiting defilements.
Yes.
Yeah, and there's tremendous debate about what that line means. So I would actually refer to, again, the volumes of debate around that verse.
Because like to me, I actually kind of have that, not in terms of the mind is the atta, but rather that the nature of the mind. Yeah, kind of like the simile, the usual simile of the mind being like the clear sky, and spacious and open, and the defilements essentially being clouds. So the clouds don't define the mind, but are present in the mind, and you can remove them from the spaciousness of the mind.
Yeah, I mean, I would point to the idea that the basic characteristic of the mind is clear knowing. This is how it's defined in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. The basic character of the mind is clear knowing. But when there are defilements present, then that is blurred.
Yeah.
The ability of the mind to know clearly is blurred by the presence of defilements.
Yeah, so maybe nature in terms of like the quality of the mind that is present, which is also what creates the conditions for awakening to be possible.
Yeah, so why I hesitate a bit is about applying the term wholesome to it. So the quality of the mind is knowing, in the same way that the quality of glass is to let light through. But glass is not wholesome, it just lets light through.
Right.
So the quality of the mind is not inherently wholesome. Its quality is simply to know things.
I see. Okay. Yeah, that's a good distinction. And Andrew, you're
I was just gonna follow up a little bit and ask, like, what about then something where, like, nibbana dhatu, which is unconditioned, does that not have any like quality about it?
Its only quality is that it's unconditioned. So any other quality would be a condition, and therefore doesn't apply. So you can't say that nibbana dhatu is wholesome, but you also can't say that it's unwholesome. These words just don't have any relevance.
Yeah, completely. Just okay, got it.
Yeah.
And Bhavani asks, what is the purpose of understanding emptiness?
I actually just gave a long talk about this last night, so I would refer you back to the long talk from last night.
Yes, actually, Bhante just gave a talk on emptiness in the Pali Canon, so you can find it, Bhavani, in the like recent past talks on the channel, like literally recent. And Sudha asks, does the Buddha talk about being generous to those who are not Aryas, who may cheat the person who is generous? For example, someone is generous to friends, but those friends run away with one's money. Is it hurting the person who runs away if you're generous to that person? I'm a little confused.
No, if you give something to a person, then you are performing a good act by performing an act of generosity. And what the other person chooses to do is their own choice. So you are not hurting anybody. By giving a gift, you're always doing something good. It's what the other person chooses to do. Well, then they're making their own choices. Again, if somebody chooses to do something bad with the gift you give them, well, that's their choice, and that's unfortunate. But it's not. You're not doing it to them. It's their own decision.
I think, actually, to quote Bhante Sumita, a wonderful Sri Lankan monk who spent a lot of almost half of the year last year here at Empty Cloud Monastery, if not longer. Anyway, he was saying, our practice with dada needs to be letting go, not following up. We let go, and then we're like, hey, what have you done with this? Or how have you done with that? And blah, blah. No, your duty should be just let go, and that's it. And then it's the other person's karma to do whatever it is. You can't influence that. And Patricia says, early Buddhism and Theravada, what would be the principal differences and how being aware of these may support one's practice? Well, I'll try to do long story short. But anyway, we usually talk about Theravada, Mahayana, and Vajrayana as, three traditions, which actually have all sorts of lineages within them, but kind of broad strokes. Actually, to be even more broad, it would be Theravada and Mahayana. So Theravada is one of the lineages, and early Buddhism usually is a term that is has been coined to refer to the teachings that are the closest preserved after the Buddha's death. And those not necessarily only belong to the Theravada lineage or the Mahayana lineage, but can be shared. And so usually people who practice or have an aspiration towards early Buddhism or do an investigation, we actually also have a sort of I wouldn't say aspiration, but yeah, we try to practice in a way that entails a constant investigation of the teachings, and try to fully understand what was the intention of the Buddha when he taught the Dhamma, when he taught the Vinaya. And that means that not necessarily one needs to copy and paste one single tradition and do everything that they do, but also not refusing things that are later developments if they seem to be in the same spirit that they were taught at the very beginning by the Buddha. So this means it's a constant work in progress. So there are sometimes some doctrinal differences. So usually, for example, people who like early Buddhism privilege the suttas instead of later parts of the canon, for example, the Abhidhamma or the commentaries, etc. Other things are maybe being actually more literalist in also the practice of Vinaya, for example. Other thoughts, Bhante, maybe?
I think that gets the point across pretty well.
Yeah.
I wouldn't recommend getting too caught up in these labels, though, but rather just read the suttas and try to understand them and try to practice them. You really can't go wrong with reading and practicing the suttas.
Yeah. I would also, though, add that it's very important that when we start getting into these, as Bhante mentioned, labels or aspirations too, that we don't throw the baby with the bathwater, as they say. So sometimes people can get very wrapped up with it, especially if they're not born Buddhist. And when you're not born Buddhist, then you don't have an affinity with certain elements of the Dhamma. So it's very easy to misinterpret certain things that are present in the tradition and then think that they are superfluous, that they're cultural, that they're not needed. And in that way, you're basically throwing away integral parts of the Dhamma that instead are extremely beneficial for the practice. So at Empty Cloud Monastery, we're actually very committed to have a strong connection with a lot of lineages throughout Asia. So there's no Western Buddhism without Asian Buddhism. So any monastic who is sincere in practicing Dhamma Vinaya is welcome here. And we try to create and foster a sort of place where people can learn from each other and also discuss differences in understanding of Dhamma and and try to foster a mutual sort of appreciation and understanding. And Pial asks, is so-called mind a construction but inherently empty in nature and simply aggregates arising and passing away, nothing substantial in between?
Yes. That's exactly correct.
Okay, well, that was fast.
As I said, I like easy questions. That question contained its own answer, which was quite easy.
And good to see you, Renata. That's our neighbor, and Ki, welcome. All right, well, that seems like the last question for tonight, unless something else pops up last minute. And all right, well, thank you all for then joining us this evening. We will be back next week. So every Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, we have live streams at 8 a.m. and 7:30 p.m. New York City time. And next monk chat, there will also be another bhikkhuni present, a special guest. So stay tuned to discover who this bhikkhuni is. All right, so we can end with 3 sadhus.
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.
May you all be well and happy, and may all good things come to you.